The morning air was crisp and cold, biting at Sarah's cheeks as she stepped off the bus. It was a 20-minute walk to the audition hall, but she didn't mind the cold. It helped wake her up, or at least that was what she told herself. In reality, she was a bundle of nerves. She clutched her worn-out folder to her chest, protecting the sheet music inside, as if it were a stack of gold bars. At 22 years old, Sarah felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an unknown abyss. She wasn't. Like the other people walking toward the large glass building. As she got closer, she could see the crowd gathering outside. It was a sea of high fashion and confidence. There were girls in expensive leather jackets holding iced coffees, chatting loudly about their vocal coaches and their yoga routines. There were guys with perfectly styled hair and designer sneakers, tuning guitars or humming complicated scales. Sarah looked down at her own clothes. She was wearing a simple blue dress she had found at a thrift store 2 years ago. It was clean and pressed, but it was old. On her feet were a pair of plain black flats, scuffed at the toes from walking so much to work. She felt a wave of insecurity wash over her. She felt small. She felt invisible. "Move it, we're going to be late." A tall girl in a faux fur coat snapped, bumping into Sarah's shoulder as she rushed past. Sarah stepped aside quickly. "Sorry," she whispered, even though it wasn't her fault. She took a deep breath and joined the end of the line. The line moved slowly, snaking around the block. The sun was coming up now, casting a long shadow over the city. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter around herself. She thought about her apartment back home, a small, drafty place above a laundromat. She thought about her job at the diner, the smell of grease and coffee that seemed to stick to her skin no matter how many showers she took. This audition wasn't just a dream. It was a lifeline. She wanted something more. She wanted to sing. Her grandmother had always told her she had a gift. "You have a voice, Sarah," her grandma used to say, sitting in her old rocking chair. "It's a God-given talent. Don't you ever waste it." Her grandma had passed away 2 years ago, and Sarah had promised herself she would try. She had been singing in her church choir since she was a little girl, hiding in the back row, afraid to be heard. But today, she had to be heard. As the line shuffled forward, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear the chatter of the people around her, who were discussing the judges. She knew who they were. The panel was made up of 3 giants in the music industry. There was a famous pop diva known for her glamorous lifestyle and sharp tongue. There was a soul singer who had discovered the biggest stars in the country. And then there was the Critica man, who took pleasure in tearing people apart on live television. "I heard he made a guy cry yesterday," the boy in front of Sarah said to his friend. "He's wearing a jacket that probably cost more than Sarah's rent. He told him his voice sounded like a dying cat." Sarah swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry, like she had been eating cotton balls. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small bottle of water, taking a tiny sip. Her hands were shaking so much the water splashed a little onto her dress. She quickly dabbed it with her sleeve, praying it wouldn't leave a stain. Finally, she reached the doors. A security guard stood there with a clipboard and a scowl on his face. "Name," he barked. "Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice barely audible. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her worn-out shoes for a second. He checked his list. "Number 402. Go inside and wait in the holding pen.
Oh.
Don't make any noise." "Thank you," she said softly. She walked into the massive lobby. It was even more intimidating than the outside. The ceilings were incredibly high, and the floor was polished marble that echoed with every step. The room was filled with rows of metal chairs. Hundreds of people were sitting there, some pacing nervously, others stretching their vocal cords. Sarah found an empty seat in the corner, far away from the groups of confident-looking contestants. She sat down and placed her folder on her lap. She watched the room. It felt like a different world. Everyone here looked like they belonged. They had the right look, the right clothes, the right attitude. Sarah felt like an intruder. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:30 a.m. She had been here for an hour. They were still on number 350. This was going to take all day. She closed her eyes and tried to visualize the stage. She imagined herself standing in the spotlight, holding the microphone, and opening her mouth. In her mind, it was beautiful. But when she opened her eyes, reality set back in. She wasn't on a stage. She was just a girl from a small town, sitting in a cold lobby, waiting to be judged. A woman with a headset walked into the center of the room and clapped her hands loudly. "Okay, listen up, everyone. We are running behind schedule. No warm-ups in the lobby. If you are caught singing, you will be disqualified. Keep your voices down." The room went quiet, but the tension grew thicker. Sarah looked at the girl sitting next to her. The girl was checking her makeup in a compact mirror, looking terrified despite her expensive outfit. Sarah gave her a small, sympathetic smile. The girl looked at Sarah's simple dress and then looked away, clearly not interested in making friends. Sarah turned her attention back to her folder. She opened it and looked at the lyrics. She had chosen an old song, a classic ballad about finding hope in the darkness. It wasn't a trendy pop song. It didn't have a heavy beat or a catchy hook. It was just a melody that required a lot of heart. She hoped the judges would listen. She hoped they could see past the thrift store dress and the nervous smile. Time seemed to drag on. Every time the door to the audition room opened, everyone's heads snapped up. Sometimes a contestant would walk out crying. Sometimes they would walk out looking triumphant. Once a guy walked out looking furious, kicking a trash can on his way out. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. She tried to think about her grandmother again. She remembered the smell of her house, the way she used to bake apple pies on Sundays. She remembered the strength in her grandmother's hands when she held Sarah's face and told her she was brave. "You are brave, Sarah," she whispered to herself. "You can do this." Number 398. A voice called out over the speaker system. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She was so close. She wiped her sweaty palms on her dress. She stood up and smoothed her hair, checking her reflection in the glass of the exit door. She looked pale. She looked tired. She also looked determined. She walked toward the line forming near the stage doors. There were only 4 people in front of her now. She could hear the muffled sounds of music from inside the auditorium. She could hear the voices of the judges, though she couldn't make out what they were saying. The air back here was heavy with anxiety. The guy in front of her was shaking so badly his teeth were chattering. "Hey," Sarah said gently to him. "Good luck." He looked back at her, surprised. "Thanks, you too." "I think I'm going to pass out." "Just breathe," Sarah said, remembering the advice her choir director had given her years ago. "It's just a song. Just tell the story." He nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, just a song." Sarah watched the doors open and close as contestants went in and came out. The feedback was instant. If they were bad, they were out in 30 seconds. If they were good, they stayed a bit longer. The fear of rejection was palpable. It hung in the air like smoke. Sarah knew that in a few minutes, she would be the one walking through those doors. She would be the one standing under the bright lights, facing the 3 people who held her future in their hands.
Ow.
She adjusted. The folder in her hand, took one last deep breath, and stepped forward as the number 401 was called. She was ready, or at least she hoped she was. The heavy door swung open with a creak, and the man with number 401 stumbled out of the audition room. He was clutching his guitar case, his face flushed red with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He didn't look at anyone, just kept his head down and marched quickly toward the exit, his boots echoing loudly on the polished floor. Silence fell over the small group of contestants waiting in the hallway. Everyone watched him go, knowing exactly how he felt. The rejection in that room was thick enough to choke on. Number 402, a bored voice called out from inside the room. Maya took a sharp breath, her lungs filling with the stale air of the hallway. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for and dreading for months. She smoothed down the front of her simple dress one last time, wishing she had anything else to wear. But this was who she was. She stood up, her legs feeling a little shaky, and walked through the open door. The first thing that hit her was the temperature. The auditorium was freezing, much colder than the hallway. The second thing was the sheer size of the room. It was a massive space, with high ceilings and dark velvet curtains covering the walls. The stage was raised about 3 feet off the ground, bathed in a blindingly bright spotlight. In the center of that light stood a single microphone on a stand. It looked lonely and forbidding. Behind a long table sat the 3 judges. They were far away, at the other end of the room, silhouetted against the bright lights. Maya walked toward the stage, her flats making soft, squeaking noises on the wooden floor. She felt small. Very small. It felt like walking into a lion's den, but she had no shield and no sword. All she had was the song in her heart. She climbed the stairs to the stage, the wood groaning slightly under her weight. She walked to the center and stood behind the microphone. The light was so intense that she couldn't see the audience or the judges clearly. It was like looking into a white fog. She could hear the shuffling of papers and the sound of someone sipping a drink from the darkness in front of her. Name and age? A voice boomed. It was a man's voice, deep and authoritative. It was the critic, the one everyone feared. "Maya," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She leaned closer to the mic, terrified it wouldn't pick up her sound. "I'm 22 years old." 22, the voice repeated. He didn't sound impressed. "And what are you going to sing for us today, Maya?" "I'm going to sing At Last," she said softly. By Etta James, and I'll be doing it a cappella. There was a pause, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Then a woman laughed. It was a sharp, high-pitched laugh that cut through the quiet air. It was the pop diva, the superstar judge, a cappella. The woman's voice floated up from the darkness, dripping with skepticism. "Honey, do you know where you are? This is a professional competition. People bring bands. They bring backup tracks. You're going to stand there and hum to us?" "It's not humming," Maya said, her voice gaining a tiny bit of strength. "It's singing," another voice chimed in. This one was smoother, like a jazz radio DJ. It was the soul singer. "Bold choice, kid. Very bold. Or maybe just foolish. A cappella exposes every flaw. You really think your voice is good enough to stand alone in this room?" Maya gripped the stand until her knuckles turned white. She could feel the sweat starting to bead on her forehead. "I just want to sing. That's all." The critic sighed loudly, the sound rushing through the speakers like wind. "Let's get this over with. I've heard enough At Last auditions to last me a lifetime. It's usually a disaster. Don't waste my time, Maya. If you can't sing, walk off now." "I can sing," she whispered to herself. She closed her eyes for a split second, blocking out the bright lights and the mean voices. She thought about her grandma's house. She thought about the smell of the rain on the roof. She thought about the feeling of singing in the shower, where nobody could judge her. She opened her eyes and looked out into the darkness. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel their eyes on her. They were waiting for her to fail. They were waiting for a reason to press their buzzers and send her home. The air in the room felt hostile. It was thick with expectation and cruelty. "You look nervous, Maya," the pop star said, her voice mocking. "Your knees are shaking. Are you sure you shouldn't just go home and put on some nicer clothes? That dress looks like it's from a bargain bin." The other two judges chuckled. It was a low, dismissive sound. They weren't laughing with her. They were laughing at her. They were tearing her apart before she had even sung a single note. It was a game to them. She was just entertainment for their boredom. Maya felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run off the stage and hide in the bathroom. But her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Something inside her, a tiny spark of anger, flared up. Who were they to laugh at her? Who were they to judge her clothes? They didn't know her. They didn't know how hard she had worked to get here. They didn't know about the late nights or the early mornings. They didn't know about the holes in her shoes or the empty fridge in her apartment. She took a deep, shaky breath and centered herself. She blocked out the voice of the critic telling her she was going to be terrible. She blocked out the pop star laughing at her dress. She focused entirely on the melody in her head. She could hear the piano intro in her mind, slow and steady. She could hear the strings swelling. "Whenever I hear that song, I want to sleep," the critic grumbled. "Hurry up." Maya closed her eyes. She lifted her chin slightly. She ignored the trembling in her hands. She placed one hand gently on the stand to steady herself. The room went silent, waiting for the train wreck they were expecting. The air was tense, like the moment before a storm breaks. Maya inhaled, filling her chest with air, and prepared to let the only weapon she had, her voice, do the fighting. She was just a simple girl from a small town, standing on a big stage, but for the next 3 minutes, she decided she wouldn't be small anymore. She opened her mouth, and the world around her faded away. The air in the massive auditorium grew heavy with a suffocating silence. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning system and the distant muffled traffic from the street outside. Maya stood frozen in the blinding spotlight, her hands still gripping the microphone stand. She had just told them she was ready to sing, but the response she received was not a nod of encouragement or a word of patience. Instead, the silence was shattered by a sound that made her stomach drop. It was the sound of a pen tapping aggressively against a hard table. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythmic, impatient noise that seemed to echo in the vastness of the room. It came from the center chair, where the critic sat. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. He was looking down at his paperwork, checking his watch, tapping his pen as if he were waiting for a bus, rather than listening to a human being pour their heart out. A cappella, Etta James, the critic drawled, not lifting his eyes. He let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to deflate the entire room. This is going to be painful. I can already feel the headache coming on. Do us all a favor, Maya. If it's bad, just stop. Don't torture us. Laughter rippled through the darkness. It wasn't the kind laugh of joy. It was the cruel, biting laughter of people who feel superior. It came from the pop star on the left. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking, and crossed her arms. She looked at Maya with a mixture of pity and amusement, like a scientist looking at a bug under a microscope. "Look at her," the pop star said, her voice carrying clearly across the stage. She didn't bother lowering her tone. "She's trembling. It's kind of cute, actually. Like a little deer in headlights. But seriously, honey, that dress? Did you get lost on the way to a costume party? I think I saw something like that in a thrift store window for $5 yesterday." The soul singer chuckled, a deep rumble in his chest. He took a sip of water and shook his head. "It takes courage to come out here looking like that," he said, gesturing vaguely at Maya's simple blue dress. "I'll give you points for confidence, honey. But in this business, image is everything. You can't sell records looking like you just washed the dishes." Maya felt her face burning hot. The humiliation washed over her like a bucket of ice water. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She wanted to turn around, run down the stairs, and out the heavy doors into the cold air where nobody knew her name. She felt small. She felt foolish. She felt like a fraud for thinking she could ever belong in a room with these people. They were shining stars, and she was just a speck of dust. "Can we hurry this along?" The critic snapped, his patience completely gone. "I have a lunch reservation in 20 minutes, and I don't want to spoil my appetite with a bad performance. Sing or go, but do something." The laughter grew louder. Someone in the shadows, perhaps a cameraman or a producer, let out a loud guffaw. It felt like the whole world was laughing at her. Maya's vision blurred slightly as tears threatened to spill over, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. It's not here. Not in front of them. She looked out into the darkness, trying to find a friendly face, but there was none. There were only the 3 silhouettes behind the table, waiting for her to fail. They had already written her off. They had already decided she was a joke before she had sung a single note. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But life rarely was. Something shifted inside Maya's chest. It started as a tiny spark of anger, deep down where she kept her fears. Why should they decide her worth? Why should their laughter stop her? This was her dream. This was her chance. She hadn't taken to buses and walked 10 blocks in the cold to be made fun of by rich people in comfortable chairs. She was here to sing. She tightened her grip on the microphone stand until her knuckles turned white. She took a deep, shaky breath, filling her lungs until they felt like they might burst. She closed her eyes for a brief second, shutting out the harsh spotlight, the sneering judges, and the cold room. She retreated into her mind. She saw her grandmother's kitchen, smelled the cinnamon and apples, felt the warmth of the sun through the window. She remembered the feeling of the hymn book in her hands, the sound of the choir lifting their voices together. When she opened her eyes again, the fear was still there, But it was different now. It was no longer a paralyzing force. It was fuel. She squared her shoulders. She lifted her chin. She looked directly at the spot where the critic was sitting, even though she couldn't see his eyes. "I'm ready," Maya said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. It cut through the whispers and the giggles. The critic rolled his eyes, visible even in the dim light. "This I have to see," he muttered sarcastically. 3, 2, 1. Maya ignored him. She didn't count. She didn't wait for a signal. She just opened her mouth, and the music that had been building up inside her, trapped for so long, finally broke free. She didn't start softly or timidly. She started with a power that surprised even herself. The first note rang out, clear and pure, like a bell ringing in a valley. It was a sound that demanded attention, a sound that refused to be ignored. For the first few seconds, the reaction was slow. The pop star was mid-sip of her water. The soul singer was looking at his phone. The critic was still tapping his pen. But as Maya's voice swelled, filling every corner of the vast auditorium, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The laughter died in their throats. The tapping pen stopped mid-air. The cynical sneers froze on their faces, replaced slowly by a look of utter shock. They had prepared themselves for a squeak, a flat note, or a pathetic whimper. They had not prepared for this. The sound that poured out of Maya was not just a voice. It was a physical force that seemed to push the air right out of the room. It started low, a rich velvety hum that vibrated in the floorboards and traveled up the legs of the judges' table. Within seconds, that low hum grew into a soaring melody that wrapped around the high ceilings of the auditorium like ivy. It was the kind of voice that didn't just sing the notes. It lived inside them. For the first few moments, the reaction in the room was one of total paralysis. The critic, who had been tapping his pen with such arrogance just seconds ago, froze. His hand hovered over his paperwork, the tip of the pen resting on the paper, but he didn't move. He didn't blink. The tapping stopped instantly, as if the hand holding the pen had suddenly turned to stone. His mouth, which had been twisted into a sneer, fell open just slightly, the lower lip trembling as the sound washed over him. The pop star on the end had been taking a sip of water when Maya began. As the first few words of the song left Maya's lips at last, the woman stopped drinking. The glass remained halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She slowly lowered the glass, her grip tightening so hard on the cup that her knuckles turned white. The water inside the cup rippled from the shaking of her hand. She exchanged a quick, panicked glance with the singer next to her, a look that said, "Asterisk, is this really happening?" Asterisk. It was the soul singer, however, who reacted the most viscerally. He had been leaning back in his chair, looking entirely unimpressed and bored. As Maya's voice hit the first chorus, climbing higher and higher into a range that most singers only dream of reaching, he actually jumped. It was a subtle movement, a sudden straightening of the spine, as if an electric current had passed through the chair and into his body. He pulled his sunglasses off his face and tossed them onto the table, not caring where they landed. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on the small figure in the spotlight. The silence that followed the mockery was no longer just a lack of noise. It was a heavy, reverent hush. It was the kind of silence you feel in a church or a library, where the air itself feels sacred. The sound of traffic outside completely disappeared. The hum of the lights faded away. The only thing that existed in the entire world was the sound coming from Maya. She didn't look at the judges anymore. She couldn't. She looked at them and saw them laughing. She knew she would crumble. So she closed her eyes tight, shutting out the harsh lights and the scary faces. She transported herself back to that tiny living room. She wasn't in a cold auditorium anymore. She was sitting on the braided rug next to her grandmother. She was singing for the one person who had ever truly believed in her. And because she was singing for love, not for a contract, the emotion was raw. It was unpolished and real. She sang about loneliness, and her voice cracked slightly on the word blue. But it wasn't a bad crack. It was a human crack. Filled with so much pain that several people in the shadows of the room, the cameramen, the sound engineers, felt a lump form in their throats. She sang about waiting, and the patience in her tone was heartbreaking. Then she sang about finding love, and her voice exploded with a joy that was radiant and bright. The acoustics of the hall, which had seemed so cold and empty when she walked in, were now her best friend. They caught every nuance of her tone, spinning it around the room and throwing it back at her. It sounded like there was a hidden orchestra backing her up, but it was just her. Just one girl and a microphone. On the stage, Maya felt a change happening. She felt the trembling in her hands stop. She felt the tightness in her chest loosen. The fear that had been weighing her down like an anchor suddenly lifted. She wasn't the girl in the thrift store dress anymore. She wasn't the waitress from the diner. She was a queen. She was powerful. The realization rushed through her veins like adrenaline. They could mock her clothes, they could mock her background, but they could not mock this. This talent was undeniable. It was a gift, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding it. She was letting it shine bright and blinding. Halfway through the song, Maya opened her eyes. The tears she had been holding back were now streaming down her face, leaving wet tracks on her cheeks, but she didn't care. She looked directly into the spotlight, letting it blind her. And she poured every ounce of her soul into the climax of the song. She hit the high note, a long, sustained, piercing note of pure perfection, and held it. She held it so long that the audience in the waiting room, watching on the monitors in the hall, gasped in unison. Back in the auditorium, the critic dropped his pen. It rolled off the table and hit the floor with a loud clatter, but nobody flinched. Nobody looked down. In that moment, if a bomb had gone off outside, these three judges probably wouldn't have noticed. They were mesmerized. The pop star had brought her hand up to cover her mouth, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The arrogant mask was completely gone, replaced by a look of humble awe. She looked like a fan, not a judge. The soul singer was rubbing his beard, shaking his head slowly from side to side, a smile playing on his lips. He recognized greatness when he heard it. He knew that raw, untrained talent was rare. Most people came in here sounding like robots, mimicking what they heard on the radio. But Maya sounded like the radio before the auto-tune. She sounded like history. As the song began to wind down, Maya lowered the volume of her voice. The big, booming sound softened to a whisper, like a gentle breeze at the end of a storm. She sang the final words, "And I found my dream," with a tenderness that made the silence feel heavy, almost thick enough to touch. When she finally stopped singing, the last note seemed to hang in the air for a long time, echoing softly against the walls. Maya stood there, breathing hard, her chest heaving up and down. She stood perfectly still, waiting for the rejection. She expected them to laugh now, to say it was a fluke, to tell her to get out. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, bracing herself for the insults to start flying again. But there was nothing. Just the sound of her own breathing. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds passed. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the loudest silence Maya had ever heard. It was the silence of people who have just seen something miraculous and don't know how to speak yet. The final note of the song seemed to hang in the air like a delicate soap bubble, floating in the vast space of the auditorium. Maya stood perfectly still, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, terrified of what she would see when she opened them. She expected the mockery to return. She expected the critics to exchange bored glances, to buzz the buzzer, to tell her that the beginning was good but the end was a mess. She was ready to run back to her normal life, back to the diner in the quiet town, and forget this ever happened. But the silence that met her wasn't the silence of boredom. It was heavy, thick, and electric. It was the kind of silence that descends when something truly magical has just happened, when people are too stunned to speak. The air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. The shuffling papers had ceased. Even the traffic outside the building felt miles away. Slowly, Maya opened her eyes. The bright spotlight blinded her for a second, but as her vision adjusted, she looked out toward the judges' table. She couldn't see their expressions clearly in the glare, but she could see their posture. The critic, who had been slouching in his chair with boredom, was now sitting bolt upright. His pen, which had dropped onto the floor, lay forgotten. The pop star was leaning forward, her elbows on the table. her face completely devoid of the arrogance she had worn just minutes ago. For a terrifying 5 seconds, nobody said a word. Maya felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. Asterisk, was it bad, she thought? Asterisk, did I mess up the words? Her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to break them. She gripped the microphone. Stand, her knuckles turning white, waiting for the axe to fall. Then, from the darkness of the far side of the table, a single sound broke the quiet. It was the sound of slow, rhythmic clapping. It was the soul singer. He was looking at her with a wide grin, his eyes shining. He didn't look like a judge anymore. He looked like a fan who had just witnessed a miracle. Wow, he said softly, the microphone picking up his voice and booming it through the speakers. Just wow. It seemed to break the spell. The pop star stood up. She smoothed her designer skirt and walked to the front of the table, stepping out of the shadows and into the dim light. She didn't look at Maya with pity or mockery anymore. She looked at her with something that looked a lot like respect. I have been in this business for 20 years, the pop star said, her voice steady but soft. I have heard thousands of voices. I have heard people with perfect technique, people with amazing ranges, people with millions of dollars in training behind them. But I have never, in all my life, heard anything like that. She paused, looking directly at Maya, who stood frozen on the stage. You made me forget where I was, made me feel every word of that song. That is a gift you cannot buy in a store. The critic, the man who had been so cruel just moments before, slowly stood up. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked humbled. He adjusted his suit jacket and cleared his throat, looking down at his papers before looking back up at the stage. I owe you an apology, he said. His voice wasn't booming now. It was quiet, almost awkward. I judged you before you sang. I judged your dress. I judged your nerves, and I was wrong. It is rare that I am wrong, but today I was very, very wrong. Gave a small, rare smile. That was the most honest, most beautiful performance I have heard on this show in a decade. Silence this room, Maya, and that is a very hard thing to do. Maya felt the tears welling up again, but this time they weren't tears of fear or shame. They were tears of relief. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep them back, but a few escaped and rolled down her cheeks. But she wasn't the simple girl anymore. She was a singer. She was heard. So, the soul singer said, rubbing his hands together excitedly, the question isn't whether you are good enough. The question is, what are we going to do with you? Because you, my dear, are a star. At that moment, a noise erupted from the back of the room. The doors to the auditorium had been opened by the stage crew, and the contestants who had been waiting in the lobby could hear what was happening. They were standing in the doorway, watching in silence. But now, as they saw the judges standing and clapping, they erupted into wild cheers and applause. The sound rushed toward the stage like a wave. It was deafening. It was the sound of people cheering, not for a pop idol, but for the underdog who had won against the odds. The critic walked over to the center of the stage and held up his hand. Silence in the lobby, he yelled, but he was smiling as he said it. He turned back to Maya. You don't need to wait for the verdict. You know what it is? You're going through to the next round. Frankly, I can't wait to hear what you do next. The pop star nodded vigorously. I want to work with you, she said bluntly. I don't say that often, but there is a rawness in your voice that needs to be recorded. We are going to make beautiful music together. Maya couldn't believe her ears. It felt like she was in a dream. She looked from one judge to the other, their faces smiling and approving. Just 10 minutes ago, she felt invisible, like a speck of dust on the floor. Now she felt like she was glowing. She realized that the simple dress she was wearing didn't matter. The scuffed shoes didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was what was inside her, and she had finally let it out. Thank you, Maya whispered into the microphone, her voice trembling but strong. Thank you so much. No, the soul singer said, shaking his head. Thank you. As the applause continued to roar around her, Maya unhooked the microphone from the stand. She felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She walked to the edge of the stage, the bright lights warming her skin. She looked out into the darkness, imagining the millions of people who would see this on television. She hoped there was another girl out there, who'd be sitting in a thrift store dress or working a job she hated, who would see this. She hoped that girl would know that it didn't matter where you came from or what you looked like. If you had a dream and you were brave enough to fight for it, the world would eventually stop laughing and start listening. Maya walked off the stage, her head held high. The heavy doors closed behind her, shutting out the applause, but the sound remained in her heart. She walked down the long hallway, toward the exit, her flats squeaking on the floor. But she didn't walk nervously this time. She walked with a purpose. She was no longer just a waitress from a small town. She was Maya, the girl with the golden voice, and she was just getting started.